Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar with Nature Nova Scotia. I'd like to start things off by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1725. These treaties did not deal with the surrender of land, but they did set out the rights and responsibilities that settlers and Mi'kmaq people owe to one another. And as such, we are all treaty people. My name is Cass, and I'm working as an intern right now at the Nova Scotia Environmental Network. NSEN is a network of 40 environmental organizations across Nova Scotia whose common purpose is to conserve and enhance the natural environment and build a sustainable future for Nova Scotia. We strive to support, strengthen, and promote the environmental work of our members by connecting them to each other, to governments, and to the public. So tonight, we're very happy to have our guest speakers, Becky, Jess, and Emma here with us from Nature Nova Scotia. Becky is the executive director of Nature Nova Scotia, and she's an ecologist specializing in plants, but she also loves birds. She manages Nature Nova Scotia's protected areas and wildlife projects, and she supervises staff working on species at risk, sustainable forestry, and urban nature projects. She also works for the Young Naturalist Club and organizes their annual bird count for the club's older youth chapter in Halifax. We also have Jess with us from Nature Nova Scotia. She is their conservation programs coordinator, and she's a plant scientist by training, but she's also fascinated by bird ecology. Jess has done bird call surveys as well as public engagement around Nature Nova Scotia BirdFriendly Cities project. She coordinates the organization Species at Risk and Sustainable Forestry projects, which include species like the piping plover. And finally, we also have Emma Bocking with us here tonight. Emma is a wetland biologist who has worked with Ducks Unlimited, and she's currently working with the Halifax Regional Municipality as an environmental specialist. So with that, I'll hand it over to our speakers from Nature Nova Scotia.
Thanks. I'm gonna share my screen right away. Bear with me. All right, does that look all right? Okay. Please ignore the date. I stole this presentation from an old presentation that Autumn from Nature Canada and I first presented to City Council back in May. It has all the relevant information we're going to be talking about today, so I didn't want to repeat any efforts there. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the BirdFriendly Cities program and why Nature Nova Scotia chose to get involved in it, and what's happened in the time since Nature Canada first approached us. So basically what happened is recognizing that a lot of birds are not doing very well in Canada, Atlantic Canada included. Nature Canada, following the example of a couple organizations in the States, set out this new program called BirdFriendly Cities. The idea behind it being that if our municipalities and our citizen groups in our municipalities could organize to start taking on bird-friendly actions, then cumulatively that might be a way to improve some of the numbers that you're seeing on my screen today. So these numbers come from the 2019 State of Birds report, which for many species was really depressing to read. The increases you're seeing here in waterfowl and birds of prey are among the relatively few conservation success stories we have in the bird world right now. Waterfowl, to put things very simply, waterfowl are doing better than some other birds in getting population numbers back up, in large part due to habitat-based conservation measures that groups like Ducks Unlimited, which operates across the North American continent, as well as other groups are doing on saving and restoring, and even building, in some cases, new wetlands. For similar reasons, we're seeing increases in wetland birds. Birds of prey, again, to put things very simply, are doing better than they were in the 60s, 70s, because the country, well, a couple countries, us, the States, and Mexico, all started acting on things like DDTs and other pesticides that were causing issues in bird eggs and female reproductive success and a couple other biological processes. I actually remember anyone over the age of 30 or so here tonight probably remembers when eagles and falcons were legitimately at risk of extinction, even here in Nova Scotia. And I remember eagles being really uncommon at home, and now I see them all the time. So those are the nice unusual examples. And a lot of our other bird groupings were not doing so well. Shorebirds in particularly have taken a pretty strong hit, in large part because of habitat loss, but also direct threats like human use, off-leash dogs, ATVs on beaches. Our grassland birds and our aerial insectivores are doing poorly for similar reasons, habitat loss, and in the case of our aerial insectivores, also certain pesticides. So our cities are tricky environments for some birds, but when we look at overall trends, they're really not faring any different. In a city like Halifax, where we have a fairly impressive urban forest and we're a pretty small city overall, we do have a pretty impressive diversity of native birds that live, breed, and migrate through here. But about a third of them have declined since the 1930s. So we estimate that 3 billion birds total in that time have just vanished, which is pretty concerning. So this is why Nature Canada started the program. And I mean, it was really easy for us to jump on board, I guess, because at Nature Nova Scotia, we share all of those concerns. So the Bird Friendly City program really, it asks people to go through an intense rubric where they assess the city's bird friendliness, and they do that in a couple different ways. So there are these categories, each with a threshold that you have to reach in order to be considered a entry level, intermediate, or high level bird friendly city. And those are things in things like threat reduction, habitat protection, and then restoration and climate resiliency, plus education and outreach. So Nature Canada reached out to us at Nature Nova Scotia, I think in late 2020, actually, was quite a while ago now, just asking if we had personally had any interest in this program, or if we could connect them with partners out here who might be interested in getting a bird friendly city group going in Atlantic Canada. So we jumped on it right away because it was so in line with the work we were already doing. But also reached out right away to our friends at the Bird Society. And so Sylvia, who some of you might know is board member at the Bird Society, was really interested in helping out. So she jumped on board right away, as did Councillor Catherine Morse from HRM. So we had a couple conversations, the three of us, just to kind of talk things over and look into what the process would be for going through this rubric that Nature Canada had, who should be in a group. Nature Canada calls them coalition groups. So it's normally a group of bird interested organizations and citizens who are just interested in birds who get together and work through the rubric. So from there, we reached out to the folks that we've worked with before and just started talking about the rubric. So this is where we were back in May on a national level, and Halifax is down here. We had a bird team established at the time, and we were just working our way through the rubric. The first couple cities officially designated, I think, were Toronto, Vancouver, and I think the third was London, Ontario, in, I think it was May 2021, so just this past year. And they scored in different levels as a result of actions that the city had already taken or that the bird teams themselves were able to work on to get them enough points for this entry level or higher status. And so, for example, in Toronto, they had things like the ravine strategy, they had a strategic forest management plan, whereas London had a really well-developed climate emergency action plan. And Hamilton actually has a biodiversity action plan. So those were things that led them to being accepted as bird-friendly cities. For the city, I mean, at Nature Nova Scotia, we think that every city in Nova Scotia should strive to be a bird-friendly city, but I think it can be hard maybe to convince other people of that if they're not already in the birding community or just don't know a whole lot about birds. Some people are really surprised when they learn that we've lost so many birds since the 70s. So something that Nature Canada, our friend Autumn at Nature Canada, talked to the council about when we presented to them in the spring were all of these benefits for the city. So there's the pride, getting to say that you're a bird-friendly city, especially if you get designated before maybe a rival city or another city in your region. There's financial benefits too. Coalition members are often nonprofit or charity groups and can bring funding to collaborative initiatives that both improve your bird friendliness, I guess, but also contribute directly to economic programs in the city. So increased ecotourism or shared outdoor recreation goals and things like that. So it wasn't a hard sell. Council was pretty excited about this idea. We did talk a little bit about birds in HRM, just to give council an idea of what was at stake. There are over 400 bird species here, many of which breed right here in HRM and even within urban Halifax. There are 270 eBird hotspots in the area and over 2,000 birders. It's a whole lot of people who care enough about birds that they're trying to identify the ones that they're seeing. So I think this was something that when we approached council with this idea, and we're asking for some support in the form of an official declaration, they would contribute to this initiative to make Halifax a bird-friendly city, but also asking for staff time. I think really profiling how many people are interested in birds probably helped in that sense. Getting into the rubric was a lengthy process. It's a very long rubric, but it was also really interesting to dive into. We realized pretty quick that we had some easy wins in Halifax. There were some things that we were doing pretty well, and then some things where we knew we already knew we were going to have some large gaps. And when we got into the rubric, we found that was definitely the case. We knew we had a lot of green spaces compared to some other large cities. We even have plans around connectivity and maintaining growth in green spaces through time. And we have a lot of people, like I said, who really care about birds. But we also don't have the kind of biodiversity planning that some other municipalities do, or at least not yet. Within our green spaces planning, there are some gaps around wildlife considerations and connectivity from a wildlife perspective. And in our development standards, we don't have a lot in Halifax yet around standards specifically for birds. So we have a lot of other things that Emma's going to talk about that benefit birds maybe indirectly, but until we started talking about these, there hadn't really been much discussion about birds specifically and what we could do in design standards for birds first that might have other benefits, if that makes sense. Yeah, so the opportunity was the coalition. So we had a group of 12 citizens at the time, which were a mixture of residents, researchers, environmental professionals, and the city. Emma was, I feel like we kind of voluntold Emma at the time to join our group because she was already working with us on some related projects. But we were really happy to have her join. Having a really enthusiastic counselor was really encouraging as well. We went through our baseline assessment and from that started pulling out pieces that we thought our group could work on even before we approached council. And so that included things like looking at the Red Book, talking about urban forest management in Halifax, the Green Network Plan, and really just doing the kind of baseline work to figure out where the detailed gaps were in existing pieces of policy or practice at the city level, where it made sense maybe for a group like ours to come in and say, we could help with these things, or here's some ideas for improvement. And then again, just emphasizing how many people we knew cared about this goal. So we made the request for official support from the city and we got it. So I think it's all right for us to say now that there is going to be a press release coming out from Nature Canada in the next couple weeks. But when we finished our rubric review, we got in with just enough points for entry-level status based on our assessment of Halifax's bird friendliness. And so it's looking like we might be designated this winter, hopefully in time for the Christmas bird count. At which point we're going to have to do a couple things to maintain status and work on it into the future to ideally get it up into those higher categories. And so that's a lot of what our group is talking about right now, what we can start doing now from the gaps that we've identified. A couple things that are coming up that are exciting are things like our mascot bird, which we originally planned for back in the summer and didn't end up doing it then. It didn't make sense with some of the other work we were doing. But we have that, and then we have a poll that will be coming out related to that Jess is going to talk a bit about too. So yeah, so this is really exciting for us. It's not often that you can just pull together a group of people and get them talking about a conservation issue and then stuff happens. So I'm really grateful for the folks that came together to work on this and move things forward. And it sounds like we're going to have really good news for Halifax in the near future. So with that, Emma's got some details around things that the city's been doing to make the city more bird friendly indirectly and now directly. So maybe I'll just pass the floor over to you, Em.
Sure. Yeah, if you can stop sharing your screen, I will share mine. All right. Does that look good? Okay. So yeah, my name is Emma. I work for the municipality, and I was involved with the bird friendly work since I had been working with ducks for, I guess, about a year now. So it was great to pick it up again from the other side, from within the municipality, and see it through a little bit. So one of the things that I found most interesting about this process and working through the rubric, and I noticed there's a question in the chat about the rubric itself, and that's basically just a table of different actions, and then for each action there's a score, and then the scores have to add up to a certain number in order to get a bird-friendly status. So you could be either entry level with the minimum amount of points, or intermediate or advanced, I think. So we have entry level, which is great. But one of the things that I found most interesting was how a lot of actions touched on bird friendliness that you wouldn't immediately think are bird friendly actions. And most of these things are under municipal jurisdiction, because a lot of times in municipal government, we come across this idea that biodiversity or wildlife protection is not necessarily something that the municipality can manage or control, because a lot of the traditional wildlife legislation is usually provincial or federal jurisdiction. But through the BirdFriendly Cities program, it highlights a lot of actions that are directly under municipal control that we can take to make our city more bird friendly. So I had a few examples, and these are all, the text on the left of the screen is all pulled from that bird friendly application. So the first one is relating to street lighting. So we were able to get points through this program because it turns out that in 2017, HRM started a program to retrofit all of the street lights in the municipality from kind of traditional light bulbs to LED lights that all face down like you see in this picture. And that's a good thing for birds, especially at nighttime, because they don't shine up in the sky and distract them, especially during migration times. And it's also saving the municipality a lot of money and reducing our emissions as well. So here's in red the number of kind of traditional or high pressure sodium light bulbs, and then the number of LED light bulbs. So you can see most of the transition happened in 2017. So that was something we were already doing, not for bird friendly reasons, but had a number of co-benefits with it. So a second example is pesticide reduction. So we're requirement with the BirdFriendly Cities program was that the municipality has a policy to reduce or eliminate non-essential pesticide use. And this one's interesting because we actually had a pesticide bylaw in HRM for a long time, but we just repealed that bylaw in the spring because the province has their own legislation, so we don't need to have one at the municipal level. But when we repealed that bylaw, we replaced it with this integrated pest management strategy. And that's the beginning of this program that we're trying to implement to focus on more ecological pest control methods with a focus on invasive species management. So we're gradually raising our communications around invasive species and figuring out how we can prioritize management in a way that reduces pesticide use, only uses it when absolutely necessary. And of course, any use of pesticides has to go through provincial laws and regulations. Another criteria was to have a climate change adaptation strategy, including specific measures relating to nature-based climate solutions. So that is something that we do have as well. We're pretty proud of our climate change action plan. And there are some actions directly related to green infrastructure and nature-based climate solutions. And you can see why this is a municipal issue because our municipal infrastructure contributes greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a responsibility to reduce those where we can, and we exist to serve residents. And so we have to help residents adapt to climate change. So adaptation is a really key part of the plan. And of course, this is also important for birds and other wildlife because by implementing nature-based climate solutions, we are also increasing green space and the proportion of maybe native plants or nesting habitat and feeding habitat for birds. The next example is relating to private homeowner naturalization. So this is to encourage people on their own private property to increase tree canopy or to support other green infrastructure initiatives like planting native plants. So I actually have two examples for this one that I just remember now, but in this fall, our urban forestry team was able to host a tree giveaway where we gave away 1,000 trees to the first people who showed up, including a number of fruit trees. And it was enormously popular. And I think they gave away 500 trees a day for 2 days in less than 2 hours or something like that. People were lined up around the block. So people love trees, and it was a really neat way to increase the urban canopy through people planting them on their property. And the second example is our Boulevard gardening project. So this is relating to an administrative order, which is kind of like a bylaw, and that was passed in 2020 to allow people to remove the sod from the boulevard in front of their house and replace it with plants, vegetables, native species, shrubs. I don't think they can be trees, but basically any other thing. And that's a neat way to increase biodiversity, increase pollinator habitat, and kind of create these small corridors for small creatures and insects and pollinators throughout the city. So the boulevard is the strip between the sidewalk and the road usually in a residential area. So you have, if you own a house there, you have technically jurisdiction over the lawn cover in that little strip in front of your house. So in the fall, we hosted a pilot project in Dartmouth on Dahlia Street where we had a plant giveaway, and people could come and take these native plants. We had echinacea and black-eyed Susans and all sorts of other beautiful flowering plants, and they could plant them in the boulevard and take up the sod and replace it with something more interesting. The next example is similar, but about public projects. So this is something that staff in the Parks and Recreation Department have been picking away at for a couple of years now, is a naturalization strategy. So this is to, in HRM or Halifax owned spaces, try to replace, again, some of that grass area with native species. So right now, this is mostly in the form of smaller pilot projects, but we're hoping that it will expand in the next couple of years. An example of a project that happened this year, this is actually a project that was led by Ducks Unlimited on Oat Hill Lake. And the Oat Hill Lake Conservation Society identified a piece of the lakeshore that was quite heavily eroded and was being used informally as a little boat launch area. So the staff at Ducks really did the work to add quite a lot of topsoil. They put in native plants and mulched it, and as you can see, greatly increased the biodiversity in that little spot, and hopefully will reduce erosion there too. And all these little projects, they add up and they increase habitat for birds. This one's in a riparian area on a lake, so there'll be shelter for birds that might use the lake, like ducks. They'll provide a food source. There'll be homes for insects that will feed other birds. So that these naturalization projects are all part of this bigger idea of making the city more bird friendly. And I think that was my last example. So I will stop sharing. There we go. Yeah, so I guess the last comment I'll make before I hand it back to Jess is in terms of next steps. We're going to present some of this information to council in the spring, see what they'd like to do for next steps and how involved we can be moving forward. And yeah, we'll go from there. So I'll hand it to Jess.
Thank you. And thanks for both the presentations were awesome. I guess I just want to briefly mention some of the things that are coming up. So Becky brought it up, but there is going to be a press release with Nature Canada. And then we have the Christmas bird count, which is it's basically a giant citizen science project where people collect sort of like a census on different bird species. We're also hoping to do a bird of the year poll. So that will be coming out, I think in January, and the public will be able to help vote for that. So that would be pretty exciting. We're also hoping to have some events surrounding the polls. So probably, hopefully around the species that wins, but we'll see how that goes. Definitely follow the BirdFriendly Halifax Facebook page for more info, and I can put the link for that in the chat. And other than that, if anybody has any questions for us, put it in the chat and we can answer or ask in person. I don't know. I have some questions and nobody else does, so.
I just wanted to say, oh, sorry. I just wanted to
No,
say
go
thank you guys for such an interesting and informative presentation.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. obviously, like, Emma, I was really interested in the stuff about planting native species. So I was wondering what, like, if you have any native species planting recommendations, or like any specific plants that would just really attract any birds.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the bird friendly committee at one point put together a list of good species for that. And I am trying to remember what was on the list, because one of the recommendations of the committee is to, like, the city has something called a red book, which is like the blueprints of how to do a bunch of engineering things, basically. And part of the red book is like which species should be planted in the right of way, or which species should be in the landscape projects of public buildings. And I think, if I can remember right, I'm sure Becky, you remember better than me, but serviceberry was on there. A lot of the, like, elderberry, a lot of those shrubs with fruit like that. Several of which are also good for people, which is neat for our edible food landscape. Yeah, anything with those fruit and berries. Becky, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I remember some species we put on that list. I feel like though in the city core especially, it's maybe the structure that some plants lend to the landscape that's more important than the species themselves. Although depending on the birds you're hoping to attract or the ones that you really care about, you might want to prioritize things like berry-bearing shrubs, for example, over other things. But for some species, there's reasons to include herbaceous plants, like pollinator type flowers, even. A lot of birds like those. But in the city, I mean, something we identified as a gap around the urban forest is that despite how impressive Halifax's forest is, it is only, in some places, it's only a lot of, in some cases, very old trees, which are great for some birds. They definitely use those spaces for habitat, and they'll eat in some of those upper branches. But a lot of species need that lower kind of shrubby, tangled vegetation closer to the ground for food and for shelter, avoiding predators. Yeah, so I think something that we need more of in the city core especially, is maybe just a bigger diversity in our landscapes. And that's something I'm personally very excited about the city's naturalization program for, because that's a big part of what it's doing. It's creating these more natural spaces in our green spaces, which in some cases are more like lawns and fields rather than wild spaces. So if you can do things like that on your property, just create something more wild, then that's almost certainly going to benefit a lot of birds.
Joy is wondering if they'll be notified of events by email. Do we have an emailing list for bird friendly?
Yeah. So if you go to that link that Jess put in the chat, at the very bottom, there is a place where you can sign up for our email list. And we'll send you a whole bunch of events. A lot of them are bird related for the spring, a lot of what we're doing in 2023. But there's also stuff in there around species at risk and other things you might be interested in. We'll also be sure, once we have an idea of what's happening in the new year around bird events, we'll make sure that the Environment Network gets that info too. I'm sure if you are here today, you probably are already following their newsletter or their social media. So definitely follow those as well.
And it looks like Barb sent a link that has a database, which could be helpful to some people.
Awesome.
Joy also says, I'd like to know where to begin to make my community a bird-friendly space. Perhaps identify the wetland area in my community and neighboring New Germany.
I think if you're interested in going like that official in-depth route to like a bird-friendly city, then Nature Canada would be the folks to talk to. And we could put you in touch with Autumn or any of the other staff there. I don't know I know that other towns in Canada have been certified. I don't know what the smallest one out there is. So I don't know if there's there's a whole lot of big cities that have taken on this effort. And I think they might have an advantage just in the number of people there are to help organize a coalition. So you can start working through that rubric together and get that input from groups. But we would definitely be interested to help, like any smaller towns or any other cities in Nova Scotia, if they were interested in taking this on, we'd be happy to talk to them about what we've learned the process.
So Heather's wondering if we use plants from Nova Scotia, because a lot of nurseries bring plants in from out of province and they're not really native plants.
Yeah, I mean, it's generally good to prioritize native species when you can. And of those, if you can buy stock that's from as close to you as possible, that's beneficial for the plants themselves. From the birds' perspective, I don't think it matters as much. The birds are just looking for structure and for food. But for your genetic stock and having plants that are well adapted to your local climate and soil biome and all of that, it's definitely beneficial to order stuff from nearby. That's not always possible. I mean, especially if you're like really deep in the country and you don't have a nursery local, or even if you're in the city, like you said, there's a lot of folks who import plants from other places. You know, do what you can. It's not the worst thing in the world to plant something from somewhere else.
And I'll add to that too. I wasn't sure if her question was directed at like, does the city operationally plant plants from Nova Scotia? And I think that's a really big challenge that the urban forestry team has, because as you just said, a lot of even nurseries in Nova Scotia bring in trees from Ontario or the US. And there's only so many places that have a big enough supply to stock a city tree department. So that is a challenge for sure. And I think I remember hearing once that something that at a provincial scale they're trying to work on to have more capacity amongst nurseries here to grow trees for towns and cities to plant in Nova Scotia. So that's definitely something that's on people's radar, which could be good to see in the future.
Yeah, that is definitely a challenge. Like in our work even at Nature Nova Scotia or the iNaturalist Club, it is sometimes hard to get bulk orders of a very specific native plant. I should give a shout out to Baldwin's though, in case folks are looking for large numbers of native shrubs and other plants. They've got a really good selection. We get a lot of stuff from them.
So Joy says we could get a group together in the community, and just like in response to that, I could definitely we could definitely get in touch. Like you could email the Nature Nova Scotia info email or reach out to me or Becky and we could figure that out.
Sure.
The next person says, have you heard of any discussion of banning the retail sale of invasive species like Japanese barberry, Norway maple, etc.?
That's a good question. There isn't, I'm not sure, Emma, you could talk about the city if there's any initiatives there. There isn't, on a provincial scale, there's no legislation or policy in place that really focuses on invasive species. And that was going to be a feature of the Biodiversity Act, which probably a lot of folks here know did not go forward in the way that a lot of us were hoping. So those regulations still have to be worked out in that specific piece of legislation. So there could maybe be something in there that would benefit invasive species management, but no, there isn't a whole lot right now.
Yeah, I think most of it is down to outreach. So the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council, which is a chapter of the Canadian Invasive Species Council, is trying to do some outreach like that to nurseries and also aquarium plant stores, because that's where a lot of aquatic invasive species come from. because it is a really big problem. Like people will buy a plant for their aquarium, which is fine if it's just going to live in your house in a glass box, but then they dump the aquarium in Little Albro Lake, and then you have an outbreak of yellow floating heart, and it costs $1 million to get rid of. So there is a lot of education that can be done where people know what they're buying, and know not to release it, or maybe eventually, ideally, those stores would stop selling certain species altogether.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'll also just I am currently in contact with the Invasive Species Council to do a webinar in February with Nature Nova Scotia. So maybe some of those questions could be directed towards them when the time comes for that webinar. I have another question. I was wondering about the sort of bird-friendly lighting that points downwards. Does this lighting apply to industrial areas, or is it sort of up to property owners' own discretion?
Yeah, that's a good question. The numbers that I showed would just be for municipally owned streetlights, lights in parks, things like that. I don't know, but I kind of would imagine that they would move towards that anyway, just because it is quite a lot cheaper in the long run because the bulbs last a while. So that would be my guess, that they would be moving towards LED light bulbs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're quite a lot brighter too. So
yeah,
for safety at night, I would think they would be better.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's a good question though.
I know there's a lot, sometimes when new facilities are being proposed, there can be, especially where Halifax is located, there can be a lot of interest in how facilities are being lighted. That's why I asked about it. But I was also wondering, ideally, if Halifax was a bird-friendly city, would we be living alongside them? Would they be living in our cities? Would they just be traveling through? What's the perfect bird-friendly city look like?
Good question.
What's the very end goal, the best bird-friendly city ever?
Well, I guess the overall goal is to get those bird numbers back up and stop declines in species groups where we're seeing the worst declines. And cities play a role in that, but it's just one role. So I think, I don't know if I have a better answer for that other than just doing the best that we can. If our bird numbers within the municipality's boundaries, or especially within the urban core, if it seems like they're going up over time, especially in those more threatened groups, I would consider that a win. But I would also consider it an interim win if a lot of people just started coming out more often to events related to birds. Because we know the more people care, the more they know about birds in their neighborhood, the more likely they are to take on their own actions. So I think the ideal bird-friendly city is maybe just one where birds are really part of the social fabric of the community. And that could probably look like a few things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think I saw a question pop up in the chat about window strikes. And I think that is part of my answer to a bird-friendly cities, where we do everything that we can do to reduce threats to birds too, like window strikes and the controversial thing around cats roaming and vehicle collisions, and also having better connected green spaces and wildlife corridor connectivity and just giving them the best chance of survival and life as they pass through or live in the city, I guess.
Yeah, with the window strikes, like Nature Nova Scotia did a project last year called Operation Window Strike, and I think we saw pretty good success with that. Like we gave out 30 free kits, and it was like people registered online for it. And yeah, we got a lot of interest in that, and hopefully if we get the funding, we'll be doing that again.
Yeah, I saw that question there, if we've tried to prevent birds from hitting windows. I'm not aware of an initiative, like a widespread initiative to cut down on window strike deaths, either in residential neighborhoods or at the city. But that is something that we're interested in, and there is some exciting work going on right now. Two of the members of our Bird Friendly Halifax coalition, Cindy Stasier and Amy Mew at Dow, are collaborating on a research project with Hope for Wildlife, where they're analyzing Hope's rehab data over time for birds specifically, to see if they can start pulling out information around how window strikes, how injured birds are coming to Hope for Wildlife, and if they're hitting windows, where those are happening, or if there's any other interesting information that they could pull out of that. And so part of our project through Operation Window Strike, which was much, much smaller because Hope has seen tons of birds over the years, but we were just reaching out to 30 homeowners. But those folks did give us interesting info about their neighborhoods, what the average size of a window in their neighborhood was like, which differed quite a bit across the city. We kind of tried to give kits out to different areas, and only having 30 of them, that was kind of difficult, but we did manage to get some like right in the core and then some kind of further out. And so it was interesting to see how windows differed across neighborhoods, and also how bird knowledge and values related to birds differed between families that were reaching out for these kits. So that project's actually wrapping up for this year, this month, when we're going to collect a second survey round of survey data from those participants, now that the migration season is over, unless you're a winter duck, I guess. And yeah, ask them how those kits did over the fall as well. So they would have had the spring and fall now to put those kits up. And yeah, we'll be asking them how they did and if they feel or think any differently about birds since putting them up. So yeah, I'd really like to do that again next year, get more people involved.
When doing like citizen science efforts, do you recommend like eBird or iNaturalist?
Oh, well, I feel very strongly, I'm in the eBird camp for compiling bird data, but I know there are people who disagree with me. One really great thing about iNaturalist is that it's okay for identifying songs. So you can record birdsong on iNaturalist and get a fairly reliable ID. There are other apps for that, like you can use Merlin too. iNaturalist is just kind of nice in that it gives you the ID and you can log it through that platform at the same time. I think I just learned on eBird, so I like eBird. Do you have a preference, Emma?
I don't, yeah, I mean, they're kind of interchangeable. Like you can enter eBird or your bird list onto iNaturalist if you want to have all of your sightings in one place. But for when I go and look at which birds are in what area, I would be inclined to look at eBird because that's where a lot of the birder experts double check all of the data. But I think they're kind of interchangeable personally. iNaturalist has all the other data, like all the plants and whatnot. But yeah.
Yeah, it looks like Joy is just commenting on closing the feeders. help for saving our birds if they're still at risk of flu. I know we briefly discussed this before we came into the webinar, but do you guys have any comments on that?
I think folks have had a lot of practice the last couple years with their own biosecurity protocols. We apply the same safety measures to birds, and we'll get through it. It's a tough time for some birds right now.
Yeah. They're such lovely animals. Yeah, I think unless anybody has any other questions, I think that's probably it.
Yeah, so does anybody else have any questions before we wrap up? Thanks again, Becky, Jess, and Emma for being here tonight and for hosting such an interesting presentation. And thank you to everyone who attended. A recording of the webinar will be emailed to everyone who registered if you'd like to rewatch or share it. The email will also include links to donate or become an NSEN member if you'd like to support our work or get more involved. And if you aren't already subscribed to our monthly environmental newsletter, I would urge you to sign up for free on our website. I would also like to mention an event before we leave that's happening next week that I'm very excited about. So we'll be hosting NSEN's first speed networking event. If you've never attended a speed networking event, it's very similar to speed dating. So participants will have multiple rounds of 3-minute one-on-one sessions with environmental nonprofit representatives and other members of the environmental community. We're going to provide some discussion prompts as well as contact information after the event. There are many benefits, both professional and personal, to networking. So join us next Wednesday night at the same time. So Wednesday at 7 p.m. You can join us to expand your green network, build new partnerships, identify opportunities for collaboration, discover career and volunteer opportunities, and just build your confidence. So I'll put that link in the chat in case anyone is interested in joining us. And thanks again, everybody, for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for everybody who came.